Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us. My name is Marta Kubica. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ELNET office in Warsaw, covering Central Eastern Europe. And today I have a pleasure to be hosting and to have this conversation with Ilan Berman, who's Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. We just had a short conversation about how much happened. So let me just wrap up the last couple of days in the regions that we'll be discussing today. So the past week was dominated by the Alaska summit between President Trump and President Putin. Trump seems to give Putin exactly what he wanted. Talks without a ceasefire, while Russian media spun it as a huge victory, mocking President Zelensky as a weak and illegitimate. Even worse, President Trump is now pressuring Ukraine to concede on Crimea, NATO, and parts of Donbass, raising real fears in Europe and Israel that Washington might be sliding closer to the Moscow side. Europe responded forcefully. Leaders from France, Germany, Britain, Italy, Poland, Finland, other EU and NATO countries all closed ranks around President Zelensky, insisting Ukraine's sovereignty must be respected and warning that you can't negotiate peace under falling bombs. At the same time, Gaza remains a wound that cuts to the heart of Israel and the Jewish world. For nearly 2 years, families of hostages have lived with unbearable pain. And this week, they led some of the largest protests since the war began. 500,000 people in Tel Aviv alone, more than 1 million across the country, demanding the government strike a deal. Today, and this is happening as we speak, mediators in Egypt and Qatar say now that Hamas has accepted a new proposal that would phase in the release of 10 leaving remaining hostages. That's the recent number that we got, and gradual Israeli withdrawal. For Israel and Jewish world, this double standard, I would call it double standard, because President Trump, on one hand, has shown relentless pressure on Kiev and refused to put the same pressure on Netanyahu and Qatar and Hamas and their proxies. So it seems like a double standard that is hard to ignore. And we're going to talk about it today, about this and more. So Ilan Berman, Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C., is here with us. We're going to have an hour for this briefing, and we'll start with, I would say, 30-minute moderated conversation, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So please write your questions in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to read them to our guest. So Ilan, good to see you. Really looking forward to see you in Warsaw again very soon. I would like to start from Iran, because I didn't mention anything about Iran in the intro. You released a book, Tehran Rising, nearly 2 decades ago. And when it was published, since it was published, Iran deepened its ties with Moscow and the proxies across the region and the Middle East. And in the light of recent Israel-Iran war, do you see continuity with the foreign policy you analyzed back then, or has, Tehran's playbook fundamentally shifted?
Let's start with an easy question, shall we? Yeah. The way I would characterize it is this way: the Iranian will to power, the Iranian idea that it is, in the words of the political scientist Graham Fuller, the geopolitical center of the universe in terms of Middle East politics, right? Because of its long imperial history, because of its centrality in the region. That hasn't really changed. And the arc of Iranian activism is very, I think too often in the West, in Europe and in the United States, we think of it in the context of Iran being a Middle Eastern actor, and almost solely a Middle Eastern actor, but that's actually not true. And in fact, over the last 2 decades, we've seen, even as Iran expands its strategic capabilities in the Middle East and builds its proxy network, builds its ring of fire around Israel. It's also been remarkably active in other parts of the world, right? Whether it's Latin America, here, to the south of the United States, or it's in Africa, or it's in Asia, right? This is a sort of a global ambition. It's a deadly ambition because a lot of what Iran is trying to do is to try to work to subvert the Western-led political order and create strategic challenges for the United States and for American allies, Israel most of all. But it's doing this in many different ways. And a lot of the what you've seen in recent years, the growing closeness between Tehran and Moscow and Tehran and Beijing, and the trilateral axis that's forming as a result, is a function of that. It's a function of Iranian ambition, but it's also a function of the fact that, like Iran, Russia and China both share this neo-imperial vision, and the empires that they've articulated, with very, very few exceptions, are actually are not in conflict with one another, right? What the vision of a greater Russia that Vladimir Putin is talking about, the vision of a greater China that Xi Jinping is talking about, actually works very nicely with the expanded ambitions of Iran itself. And so that has sort of laid the basis for all this cooperation. To me, what you've seen over the last 2.5, 3 months has been remarkably telling. First of all, because as a result of Operation Rising Lion, as a result of what we Americans call Operation Midnight Hammer, which was the Trump administration's amplification of the strikes on Iran, a lot of things happened. But one of the things that didn't happen was we didn't really see what all these sort of these critics and these opponents of military action were saying, which is that as soon as we move against Iran, you'll see this axis really congeal. You'll see this formulation. You'll see this cooperation between Moscow and Tehran and Beijing and Tehran. That didn't happen. You heard all the correct rhetoric out of Vladimir Putin, out of Xi Jinping, but you didn't really see any material function. And that's, I think that's important. And it's important for the United States and for our allies in Europe, because as the United States begins to think about how to navigate great power competition with China and with Russia and Iran, it really, I think, would do well to explore, the limits of this axis. How durable is it really? But then you also see, since then, you've seen a tremendous amount of activity within Iran itself, right? The Israeli military campaign was enormously important and enormously influential because it really showed that the Iranian regime was very much a paper tiger in strategic terms. There was Israel's military successes were really remarkable, even by the standards of the Israeli military themselves. I've talked to Israeli military officials who have said, we're astounded by what we managed to achieve. The problem with that is that for an Iranian regime, which is already rickety as a result of economic underperformance, as a result of, fissures in Iranian society, this is a very dangerous place to be. And so what you've seen since then has been this Iranian response, right? The adversary always gets a vote. So in the weeks since Operation Rising Lion, you've seen thousands upon thousands of Iranians arrested. You've seen the passage of new laws in Iran, basically criminalizing contacts with the Iranian opposition and with anybody even loosely associated with the state of Israel. You've seen an expansion of internet surveillance. You've seen an expansion in the power of the Revolutionary Guard. And you've seen this redoubling of attempts by Iran to engage with Russia and to engage with China, to put meat on the bones of this relationship that didn't really pan out during the war. So this is one to watch. And I know I'm going a little long, but the thing that bears noting is that we right now are at an inflection point as well, because the last remaining provision of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action is the possibility for snapback sanctions against Iran. That provision of the agreement it expires in the middle of October. and the United States, because the Trump administration, the first time it was in office, got America out of the deal, it does not have standing to invoke snapback. So this is really the European moment on Iran. Europe has to drive the pressure campaign against Iran. And by the same token, the Iranians are going to try everything in their power to let that deadline expire, to draw out negotiations with the Europeans, to draw out negotiations with the United States, because they see a much more favorable strategic horizon ahead.
Okay, great.
Sorry, that's a lot.
No. That was. We started with an easy question. Ilan, you have been like throughout your professional career, you've been focusing on Iran, Russia, and the Middle East. It's been years. With Gaza and Ukraine now at, I would say, the heart of Trump's diplomacy, why do you think these regions actually keep pulling the world back, and what keeps pulling you back personally to Iran, Russia, and the Middle East?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, you stand where you sit. I'm the product of Soviet refuseniks, and we emigrated to Israel from the Soviet Union, and then came to the United States. And so that connective tissue has always been there. But in addition to the sort of the cultural and the social history, is this very, very organic connection that I see, that I have seen in the past, I continue to see, between the autocrats in Moscow and the autocrats and theocrats in Tehran. There's a lot of connectivity simply because the systems are illiberal, but they're ideological, they're imperial, and they're compatible. And so the, excuse me, here in the United States, we've spent something like 25 years trying to flip Russia, to essentially pull apart the Russian-Iranian relationship, and try to convince Putin to sort of, because it's, for most of that time, it's been Putin to play better on Iran, to essentially come over to our side, to really invest in sanctions and pressure against Iran. We've been spectacularly unsuccessful. And I would argue that we've been unsuccessful, excuse me, because we don't really understand the drivers of that relationship. That relationship was a marriage of convenience right after the Soviet Union collapsed. It was a partnership on arms. It was a partnership to get the Iranians not to cause destabilizing actions in the post-Soviet space. But since then, we've really seen the growth of something that I think could be credibly called a strategic partnership that is now indispensable to both countries. Because not only have the Russians diplomatically carried the water for Iran for a long time, diluted Western sanctions, played the role of advocate in international fora like the United Nations, now the shoe's on the other foot. And the Islamic Republic is playing a key role in perpetuating the Ukraine war, for example, by providing drones, and also by doing co-production of Iranian origin drones in special purpose industrial zones in Russia itself. And so you have a very organic partnership, but it's animated by this thing that's very, very hard to dislodge. It's this antipathy to the United States. It's the antipathy to the liberal Western-led order. And it's this insurgent desire to restructure the international system to favor Tehran and Moscow, and to work against everyone else.
So you called the relationship between Russia and Iran marriage of convenience. I would like to talk about marriage of inconvenience, meaning Iran's Persian identity that sets it very far apart from the Arab world. And yet we see Tehran aligning with Arab states against Israel and against the West. I'm really wondering, can ideology and shared enemies really override such deep differences that Iran and the Arab world share?
So I don't think so. And it's interesting because there is some of that contact, but I think there's also compelling evidence in the other direction. The Saudis and the Iranians hammered out a deal brokered by China in April of 2023 to essentially normalize relations. But I read that not to be a sign that the Saudis were becoming enamored with the Islamic Republic or vice versa. I saw that as a very pragmatic decision by the Saudi government to get the Iranians to behave better, because after all, the most immediate problem, security problem that the Saudis were facing was to their south. It was the Iranian-supported Houthi rebels in Yemen. And so it was very clear for a long time that in the Southern Gulf, there was a proxy war playing out between Saudi Arabia on one side and the Sunni Arab world on one side, and Iran and sort of the insurgent Shiite part of the Muslim world on the other side. And the Saudis simply made a pragmatic decision, looking around, understanding that there was an administration in Washington at that time that was not so committed to Gulf security, that wasn't really involved and invested to the degree that its predecessor was. The Saudis had to make other plans. And the other plans involve things like transitioning the kingdom to a non-energy first economy, transitioning, attracting foreign direct investment. All of that depends on security. And so the Saudis made a decision very pragmatically that they wanted to cool tensions with Iran as a way to achieve their other geoeconomic objectives. That doesn't mean that this is a sort of a natural or organic alliance. And it also doesn't mean that that partnership is permanent if the Saudis and other Gulf states see that there are alternatives. And so one of the most important things, I think, over the last 6 months, 8 months or so, has been Israel's demonstration by its campaign in southern Lebanon against Hezbollah, by its campaign against Iran itself, demonstration that to the neighborhood that there are options other than bending the knee to the Iranian regime. There are options, there's viable options. And I think what we're going to see here in Washington over the next half year or so is an attempt to build on top of that, to really put meat on the bones of a Middle East security alliance in a much more tangible way than we've seen in the past. And I think that will create even greater freedom of maneuver for the Gulf states. And it will lessen the appeal to hammer out some sort of compromise with the Iranians.
Where in this puzzle the potential Israel-Saudi normalization fits in? I had to ask, sorry.
No. It's a very natural question. The answer is it's not clear. I would make the argument that in anticipation or right in advance of the events of October 7th, the Saudis and the Israelis were very clearly moving in the direction of normalization. In fact, Yahya Sinwar, when he was still alive, talked publicly about the fact that October 7th was carried out, at least in part, to derail this normalization trend, which fundamentally marginalized Iran and its proxies in the geopolitics of the region. To me, the striking thing is that we're now rounding the second anniversary of October 7th, and the Abraham Accords that were formalized in September of 2020, they have definitely been battered by the Israeli war against Hamas in Gaza, but they haven't been fundamentally derailed. They haven't been, Israeli relations with Morocco, Israeli relations with Bahrain, with the United Arab Emirates. These are still, they may be quieter, but they're still going strong in terms of economics, in terms of political contacts. That's because the strategic logic of partnership with Israel still obtains. These are all countries that look at Israel and they see the fast economic mover, the fast technological driver in the region. That's enormously attractive, right? They're all trying to develop, they're all trying to expand. So the geopolitics, up until very, very recently, has really rubbed against normalization, making it difficult because of what Israel has been confronting in the Gaza Strip, made it difficult for these Arab states to really lean into their partnership. I think that's beginning to change a little bit. I think a great deal depends on what comes next in the Gaza Strip and, if there's a ceasefire deal. But it also, I think, creates the opportunity and the window of opportunity for additional partners. Saudi Arabia, I think, though, isn't one of them, at least not for the immediate future, because the Saudi government has planted a flag on the Palestinian issue and the near-term creation of a Palestinian state in a way that it's going to be very difficult for not just this Israeli government, but frankly, any post-October 7th Israeli government to sort of square the circle and remain true to itself and make the Saudis happy. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other potential partners. If the Saudis aren't on the table, countries like Azerbaijan are, countries like potentially even Indonesia. And so there are quiet contacts, and there have been quiet contacts for quite a long time between the Israeli government and these foreign governments. And now you have an additional component, which I think can add fuel to the fire, which is that there is an administration back here in Washington whose one of its major achievements was the inception of the Abraham Accords in the first place, the last time it was in office. So it's a very logical thing for the Trump administration now in its second term to really emphasize progress in the Abraham Accords, really build out the architecture that it first created. So I think that's going to be a major focus moving forward.
Okay, so I see that shortly after 12 DC time, the European leaders started arriving at the White House. Let's talk about, let's talk about US, Russia, Ukraine a little bit, but also I was like, before we leave Iran completely, completely for today, I was wondering, has the Israel attack on Iran somehow revealed cracks in, how is Moscow capable to manage its, like, really, I would say, balancing act? Because we're talking about Tehran, we're talking Jerusalem, we're talking Ukraine. Like, where is Russia in all this? How are they playing with? Well, we see how they're playing with the U.S., but how is it with Israel? How is it with with Tehran? Did Israeli attack on Iran changed anything in Moscow and Tehran relationship?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think it certainly was a wake-up call for the Iranians themselves, because I think the Iranians genuinely believed that they had built such a robust partnership with Moscow that when the chips were down, when push came to shove, that the Russians would come to their aid. And that didn't happen in June. And I think what the Iranians learned from this was not to walk away from the Kremlin entirely. They don't have many choices because Iran is very much an international pariah. The number of countries that it can count as partners is vanishingly small. It's beyond Russia and China. It's just a couple of others. It's North Korea, Venezuela, just a handful more. And Iran does not have the luxury to simply say, Moscow, you didn't deliver, we're going to reconsider our relationship. In fact, the opposite is happening. You're seeing the Iranians making pains to make sure that this sort of gap never exists again. And that requires redoubled diplomacy. That requires redoubled contacts. That requires giving the Russians an expanded stake in the survivability of the Islamic Republic itself. A stake kind of like the Chinese have. Back in May 2021, the Iranians and the Chinese hammered out or the Iranian parliament ratified an agreement that had been hammered out for a $400 billion, 25-year framework deal between Iran and China. And that deal involves, if you sort of look at the different parameters, involves a tremendous number of things that are attractive to the Chinese government, including first mover advantage in Iran's telecom sector, including basing access to Iranian ports, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The message here, and remember, because these things take a long time to put together, this conversation between Tehran and Beijing started when maximum pressure of the first Trump administration was still in effect. The Iranians were hurting, and they were looking for ways to make China a stakeholder in the Islamic Republic. And that's why this deal came about. And I get the feeling that we're about to see something similar with regard to Russia as well, because the job for the Iranian regime right now is to make Russia a bigger stakeholder than it apparently right now is in the survivability of the Islamic Republic.
Okay. I was wondering, you know what? No, well, I have a few more questions, but I'll ask one now, and if we don't
Sure.
have anything from our audience, I'll continue. Um, let's go back to Alaska. Some comments compared Alaska summit to Yalta, others to Munich and Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. We have exchanged some messages over the weekend with those horrible and sometimes very funny pictures as well. Do you see it as the start of a real process, or I would say dangerous illusion of progress that actually only feeds Russia's propaganda and Russia's appetite?
So I think it's sort of somewhere in the middle. And I think the events of later today, I think, are going to determine a great many things. But I see this slightly differently. So first of all, right, there was no deal. And I think it's necessary to point out that no deal is better than a bad deal. So in and of itself, the worst case scenarios that a lot of people were thinking about a grand bargain that basically abandoned Ukraine altogether, that didn't materialize. And in fact, to me, there were signs, at least early signs, like the cancellation of the surrogates meeting that was supposed to take place after, that suggested that there was actually so little agreement that there wasn't anything to sort of to hammer out among the subordinates. From my perspective, certainly from a Ukrainian perspective, I think that's good news. What's less good news is that, at least the way I rack and stack it, the summit was a victory for Putin for a couple of reasons. Because the job that he had to do was basically threefold. President Trump, in the run-up to the summit, had said that if there's no agreement, there's going to be sanctions. He also said that if there's no agreement, there won't be another meeting. And in the aftermath of the summit, neither of those things have materialized. Right? There are no, right, at least right now, there are no additional American sanctions. Right? That is definitely a victory, at least for now, for the Russians. And there also seems to be movement towards future negotiations, depending on how the conversations of today and later this week go. That's also a net benefit for the Russians. The third objective for the Russians is basically to arrest the geopolitical trajectory of the United States, because you've really had here in Washington over the last half year, you've had a real evolution and learning process. The Trump administration came in basically equivocating between Ukraine and Russia and saying that, both were equally culpable, both were, America doesn't want anything to do with it. There's been a real learning curve here. And so I think the arc is not complete yet, but the arc that I've seen, that I've watched, is that the Trump administration is moving closer and closer to the Ukrainian position, to the European position, I think in the best possible way. What Putin wanted to do, and it's not clear whether he achieved it yet, but it clearly was an objective. What Putin wanted to do was to arrest that trajectory, right? That was his big goal at the Alaska summit. It's not clear if he succeeded, but the apparent White House receptivity to the type of things that have now been floated out in the press, territorial swaps that advantage Russia, the nullification of any Ukrainian aspirations for NATO, right? Security guarantees are fine, but you can't be part of the alliance. Giving the need to give up any claims over Crimea. All of that, I think, is very advantageous to the Russians. It's also, parenthetically, I would argue, it's sort of a retread of the Middle Eastern land for peace formula that the Israelis have tried for the last 4 decades. And we know how that has all turned out. But I think there's things for Russian propagandists to talk about, right? I mean, it's very clear. As long as the meeting didn't devolve into a shouting match last week when Putin and Trump met, that Russian propagandists and Russian state media would frame this as a victory for Putin. And the meeting was very cordial. And so I think justifiably for the Russian media, they can sort of, take a victory lap. They can sort of say that the Russian leadership for right now achieved at least part of its objectives. Whether that's a permanent condition, I think, really depends on what Zelensky says today, what European leaders say today, and ultimately what the White House decides.
Okay, you have been dealing with the Russian disinformation for many, many years. We could have a Zoom call just on that, and 1 hour wouldn't be enough. But I wanted to ask you, since you probably also follow the, the Russian media comments after the Alaska summit, what was the most outrageous from the Western perspective, summary or comment about what happened in Alaska, in your opinion?
I mean, it's a very high bar, right? I mean, the Russian media is sort of not known for its sober interpretation of events. So just like if you watched conservative media here in the United States, you'd hear a lot of, the president stood his ground. This is great. You sort of heard exactly sort of the photo negative of that, right? Trump rolled out the red carpet. There was, real acceptance. Putin's arguments about the historical importance of the U.S.-Russian relationship were very well received, right? And therefore, this sets up, sort of an abandonment of Ukraine later. I think the truth, like with all things, is sort of somewhere in the middle. It's good that there wasn't a deal, but unlike what the conservative media here say, this wasn't an unalloyed victory for Trump. And for the Russian media, right, it's true that Putin managed to put some points on the board, but it's not true that this was a wholesale victory for him. It may still end up being one, but I don't think you can say that right now.
Well, I hope it's not gonna, but again, I'm talking from perspective of Warsaw, which is very close to Moscow. Uh, but, Ilan, I would like to take a very short break, and I would like to introduce my colleague Sari Steinberg, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So if there are any, please write your questions to our Q&A on the chat.
Thanks, Marta, and thank you, Ilan, for sharing all your insights. I look forward to hearing more in response to our participants' questions coming up. To all our friends on this call, thank you for partnering with ELNET to ensure that Israel has strong alliances throughout Europe. We are working with great intensity to counter the damage done by heads of state who are making misguided pronouncements, to put it gently, and we are achieving results. The vast majority of France's elected officials, for example, oppose unconditional recognition of a Palestinian state. We learned recently that the UK's Royal Air Force has conducted at least 577 surveillance missions to help Israel locate hostages and obtain other vital intelligence. And in Central and Eastern Europe, countries there where Marta is the head of ELNET's operations have been drawing closer and closer to Israel in terms of technology, economics, and defense. If you would like to know more, please watch for our Week in Review email, which comes out every Friday, and you'll get a sense of these developments. Last week, a major study was published showing that the most effective way to improve Israel's international standing is exactly what ELNET does, bringing leaders to Israel to see reality firsthand, to meet with their Israeli counterparts, and to really get an understanding of what's happening. Since October 7th, ELNET has conducted more than 40 delegations to Israel, engaging more than 450 members of parliament, military officials, and policy influencers across Europe. Please continue to support us to the greatest extent that you're able to help us increase our impact on entire countries through our programs, which as I said, it's effective and we have great return on investment. Please bear in mind also that, of course, we're a 501c3, so every dollar you contribute is tax deductible. Randy will post the donation link and an address for mailing checks. We also accept wire transfers and stock transfers. So thank you in advance for increasing your support, for renewing your support. If you're brand new, please make your first contribution. We really need you. We're a relatively small organization that punches way above our weight across Europe, and we're making a difference for Israel and for the whole Western world. As always, our hearts are with the hostages and their families, and we are working and praying for only good news. Thank you for partnering with us.
Thank you, Sari. So we're moving to our guest questions, and I know that there is one question from Larry Hochberg, who's our chairman emeritus and one of the founders. And Larry, would you like to ask your question, or do you want me to read it to our guest?
I can read it. It's fine. Good morning.
Great.
Morning.
Good evening. Ilan, excellent summaries of very challenging items. My question really is, does Putin really fear European strength at all? And do you think Europe has the courage to stand up to what Russia wants regarding Ukraine?
So also a simple question. I would put it this way. I think the Europe, what we've seen in terms of the evolution of European thinking is enormously helpful. It's enormously encouraging. I think what you're seeing is a newfound seriousness in Europe in terms of confronting Russia. What matters to me, and sort of what I think will matter the most more broadly, is not so much the will, because I think the will, particularly in Eastern Europe, in Central and Eastern Europe, there is very much the understanding that the bear is at the door, that Russia needs to be confronted resolutely. It's the pace of production, because Europe has underinvested and undercapitalized its defense industrial complex across the continent for such a long time that if you look at the rate of production in terms of Europe and the rate of the comparable rate of production in terms of the Russian defense industry, what you've seen is that the Russian defense industry over the last year, Russia has really repurposed its economy into being a war economy. And it is now moving very, very quickly. It's producing munitions, it's producing battlefield platforms at a higher rate, at a faster rate than Europe can. So that's why you're seeing those warnings from NATO, warnings from European officials about the zone of danger being 2027, 2028, 2029, because it's going to take time for Europe, despite all of its will, despite all of its newfound resources that it's throwing at the problem, to really ramp up to a point where it's going to have credible deterrence that can really stand down the Russian military. And that to me, that's really the zone of danger. And I think it's amplified by the fact that the type of ideology that Vladimir Putin and his circle is espousing, the type of concrete actions that the Russians are doing on their periphery, not just with regard to Ukraine, but for example, with regard to Finland and Norway, really suggests that the imperial ethos in Russia runs deep. And so the zone of danger to me is that moment after Ukraine, right? Because every war must end at some point, after Ukraine, but before Europe has a real opportunity to stand down, to face down the Russians, right? Because that gap is going to be provocative for Moscow.
Okay, so then the answer is that long-term Putin fears Europe, but not today.
I think that's right.
Thank you, Larry. Ilan, I just have like a quick comment, and I would love to hear your take on that. You just mentioned something that's being discussed almost every day in Central Eastern Europe and in Europe in general, meaning that Russia moved their economy into the wartime economy, and Europe is still not there. We can see a lot of recent deals between Israel and the European countries. There is European Sky Shield Initiative, which is the air defense, integrated air defense system that will be based on Israeli and the US technologies, such as Arrow 3, David Sling, maybe Iron Dome for smaller countries as well. I know that there are a couple of countries, especially in the Baltics, that are interested in Israeli air defense and purchasing Israeli air defense following Finland. There were recent huge deals with Romania and with Serbia. The Serbia one was with Elbit, and it was just announced a couple of days ago that this European country is Serbia. How do you feel this kind of defense cooperation with Israel can strengthen our relationship? And can it really, or is it just very pragmatic? Because when you look at the military cooperation between Israel and European countries, it's really good. Like all those deals I just mentioned. On the other hand, politically, Israel seemed to have less friends than business partners, especially in the defense world. What's your take on that? How those two things are connected? Because for me, they seem very disintegrated.
No. Listen, I think they're connected, but they're heading in opposite directions, because I think all things being equal, the case for greater absorption, greater adoption of Israeli tech as Europe, as the continent's defense industry ramps up, makes total sense. And there should be a lot of appetite for this. But the politics and the optics of the Gaza war, the politics and the optics of the political decisions of Israel's ruling coalition are such that they're driving the discourse in a different direction. And here, I think, sort of all honesty demands that we say that I think the Israeli government has really mismanaged the narrative about what it's trying to do in the war, the messaging, the connectivity with European capitals, right? This is not necessarily that Israel is going to be able to dispel all the negative press, but Israel has, up until now, has really made remarkably little effort to try to dislodge the Hamas dominance on the narrative of what's happening to the Palestinians. And it's, as we can see in real time, whether it's a conversation about casualties in Gaza or hunger, famine, whatever it is, it's having a real material effect on Israel's standing internationally. That is going to have an economic effect, because it will chill enthusiasm for something that, in light of the Russia threat, should be a no-brainer for the Europeans. And by the way, that argument also goes for Asia as well. It's not just a European conversation. If Russia is the bear at the door for Europe, China is the dragon at the door for countries in the Indo-Pacific. And Chinese expansionism requires countries in South Asia and East Asia to really build up their militaries, to really partner with international allies that see things the same way. Israel is a natural partner here, and yet you see almost no activity, far less than you see in the context of Europe. There are some exceptions, right? India and Israel and what have you, but generally speaking, this is a very fertile field that Israel is not exploiting. And a lot of the reason for that is because the politics are really overshadowing these potential relationships. So I think they're related, but I think there is a tension here. And the sooner the Israeli government really starts taking messaging seriously, the sooner we're going to see a material improvement here.
Thank you. I would like to move to Tom Flesch, our ELNET US chairman. Tom, you have a question or a comment or both?
Thank you. I have both. Ilan, thank you so much. This information is really important, and you articulate it in a way that is pretty clear. I have this thought, and I don't know how it works out, but it seems to me the United States has such a significant role in a deterrent by the Europeans vis-a-vis Russia that the United States has to be there, and it has to be behind the Europeans. But at the same time, we need the European support for Israel, and we need for short term and for long term. Israel, with its technology, with its weapons, the things that the Europeans need will be going hopefully to Israel's economy and benefit of its economy. My question is, in all these negotiations that are going on, does the Palestinian-Israeli connection, those issues come into the equation when they're talking about the United States support for the European countries vis-a-vis the Russian threat?
I think it's a good question. Certainly here in Washington, the Palestinian issue, and in particular what we talked about earlier, the movement towards near-term recognition of a Palestinian state, it doesn't resonate the way it does in Europe. But it's very clear that there is a disconnect, and frankly, I think it's a disconnect that's growing a bit larger, as the war in Gaza continues. And I worry about that because it seems to me that, like you, I see this as an imminently practical partnership, an imminently practical way for Israel to be strengthened while strengthening European deterrence against Russia. And yet the politics are such that increasingly they're driving in different directions. And I would actually argue that unfortunately, the way the administration has approached the relationship with Europe has contributed to that, at least a little bit, because the administration has, when it articulated that Europe has to do more for its own defense, it wasn't articulating a Trump priority. This is something that every American president for the last 2 decades has talked about. But the way he framed it has raised questions in Europe about American steadfastness, about whether America is going to be there to backstop Europe. And so it's revived concepts that, frankly, should be left buried, right? The idea of independent European common security and defense policy, things like that, things that decouple the continent from America. And I think that's actually very unhelpful. And so my hope is that the administration, right, and all administrations, for those of you that watch what's happening in Washington now, right, remember, right, in the fullness of history, all administrations go through this learning process. No strategy survives first contact with the enemy. So we've seen 6 months of this administration, flailing about trying to dismantle a whole bunch of things. Right? That only works for so long. At a certain point, they're going to have to reconstruct. They're going to have to rebuild. There's going to be this recentering that's going to happen. And I would argue that you're going to start seeing that happen in the next few weeks because Congress comes back from summer break. There's going to be a big debate here on Capitol Hill about the National Defense Authorization Act, right? There's all sorts of things, forcing functions that are going to cause this conversation to accelerate. My hope is that as part of that, there is a real repositioning of the way the administration talks to Europe and the way the administration interacts with Europe. A lot of it depends on, frankly, on what happens with regard to Ukraine and what happens with regard to Russia and how Trump plays this. But I see the long-term transatlantic partnership as being more durable than most people understand, absent any sort of, disruption that's created because of, an American tilt towards Russia or, whatever it is. My sense is that we're transitioning back to the mean. Now, the second job becomes how do we incorporate, robust support for Israel, which we already have here in the United States. How do we port that over as part of the relationship? How do we expand European investment and a European stake? That's a political conversation. But it's not just a political conversation that happens here in Washington. It's also, frankly, one that's going to happen in Jerusalem. And one of the things to watch. And I talked to a whole bunch of Israelis. I talked to a whole bunch of American politicians on left and right. And the thing that I hear all the time is that everything that Israel managed to achieve over the last 8 months in terms of resetting the strategic agenda, in terms of demonstrating Iran's vulnerability, in terms of really breaking apart the Ring of Fire, that all becomes a transient victory if there isn't some sort of ceasefire that builds, that resets the conversation. And again, the governing coalition in Jerusalem, it has its own political calculations. They have elections coming up next year. And right there, they have elections, we have midterms. There's all sorts of moving parts, but my sense is there's a lot of stuff on the table. And there's lots of good news stories to tell about Israel and about Israeli economic dynamism and defense dynamism that should be told to Europe. And at least part of what Israel is doing politically right now is getting in the way of that. So we need to figure out a way to navigate this.
Okay, I just want to make a comment. I know there's a lot of questions in the queue right now, and we're running short in time. If you can consider when answering the questions forthcoming about what ELNET as the premier organization promoting European relations with Israel. If you had some suggestions while you're answering others about what more we can do, would appreciate hearing that. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank you so much.
Sure, my pleasure. I'll think about it. And I might even try to answer it, but if it's too hard, then I'll just avoid it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, you can always try, but
Right.
look, Ilan, we have a few more questions, and I would like to just a second. I would like to move to. Oh well, there is a lot of questions. We have one questions. We have one question about yesterday's poll in Israel shows Netanyahu losing the next elections in a year, supposedly. What do you think if an opposition government takes power? How does that change the prospects for Abraham Accords and the Saudi-Palestinian equation?
It's a good question. It's a really important question. Look, I would answer this. I have to start by saying that I work for a nonprofit, so I'm not a betting man, right? You have to have capital to be a betting man. But if I was a betting man, I would never bet against Bibi Netanyahu. He has proven himself to be such a political survivor that he may pull a rabbit out of the hat this time as well. And so, I don't think it's necessarily a done deal. What I do think is remarkable, and sort of it goes to my larger point about Gaza and the ceasefire, is I am sure at least some people on the call, like me, thought that when Israel carried out that remarkably successful military offensive against Iran, set back Iran's nuclear program by a number of years, there was an expectation on my part that this really fundamentally reset the regional conversation. And that goodwill towards Israel has proven to be remarkably fleeting. It lasted like 2 weeks. And now we're back at the conversation about Gaza and the conversation about the Palestinians. And I think Israel succeeds in the broader frame and it fails in that narrower frame. So the reason I am a sort of a big proponent of the need for some sort of settlement, some sort of ceasefire, is because Israel really needs to reclaim the narrative. And I sort of see this, what's happening in Gaza, as the big impediment. It's also, frankly, the big impediment to communicating Israel's comparative advantage to European capitals, right? To Tom's point. There is a messaging requirement. There's, sort of the way AIPAC here in Washington likes to talk about it is, Israel is a pretty easy sell when you get people over there. Yes. I think in light of the last 2 years of conflict, it's a little bit of a harder sell. And the way we can sort of reclaim that comparative advantage and really make Israel an attractive place intellectually, attractive place economically, is to expand that frame again, right? Here's everything that Israel's doing regionally. Here's everything that Israel's doing in economic terms. Don't you want to hitch your wagon to the fast mover in the region? I think that becomes harder to do the more Israelis think and say, as they said to me when I was there in May, we're stuck in Gaza, right? Because that shows, right? We can see that they're stuck in Gaza. And so not that a ceasefire necessarily will help Israel attain its war aims. In fact, right, it's enormously problematic for a whole host of reasons. But there's so much potential benefit that's on the table that will either be frittered away or won't reach its full potential, whether it's deterrence against Iran, whether it's the Abraham Accords, whether it's a stronger partnership with Europe, that my sense is that has to be balanced against the sort of the net benefit or the net detriment of what's happening. A new Israeli government, a new Israeli government that's more sort of centrist or center left. So remember, right, advisedly, Israeli politics after October 7th have ticked several notches to the right. So I don't think we're talking about a left-wing government. I think we're talking about, right, at its most fundamental transformation, a center-left government in Israel, right? And most likely probably a unity government, a center government, right? That's sort of very naturally in the center. I think the sort of the same priorities that the current administration is in Israel is grappling with will still obtain, right? Look, Israel needs a different security paradigm for the Palestinians, because we discovered on October 7th that the paradigm that they had before, right, which relied on early warning, surveillance, right, this sort of the conception that, you know, there would be trickle down economics and Hamas would moderate over time, all that's broken, right? That's gone. So Israel needs a new security paradigm that's stronger and better than what they had on October 6th. Israel needs to reconstruct Gaza, and it's not going to do it itself. It doesn't have the money nor the desire to reconstruct Gaza, so it needs partners to do that. And Israel needs de-radicalization in the Gaza Strip, right? Because otherwise, this is a sort of a perpetuating problem, right? The next generation will become radicalized, and you know, the current generation, as a result of the conflict, is probably irreconcilable. But the next generation is a lot is going to hang on this generation, right? This is a multi-year process. That's why I'm very pessimistic about the American phrase "the day after," because I don't think what we're talking about is the day after. I think what we're talking about is the generation after. But that doesn't mean that we can't start talking about it now. And the Israeli government, because of its current political composition, has trouble talking about this, because, you know, if it talks about the need for partnership with the Gulf states to do this, if it needs, you know, inputs from the outside, you know, from the Arab world in order to do this, the coalition will break apart, right? Smotrich's party or Ben Gvir's party will vote the coalition and it'll break apart. But this is a conversation that needs to happen. And the sooner the Israeli government starts changing the conversation about the generation after in Gaza, the quicker we get to that broader frame. So that's certainly my hope.
Thank you. I think you're the first person I heard talking not about the day after, but the generation after, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And it makes our work even harder, and Israel's work even harder. Ilan, I would like to thank you. We have a lot of questions that we will not be able to address today. As I said, we could be talking for, you know, we could have a marathon with Ilan Berman, you know, Zoom call in the future. But I would like to tell everyone and invite everyone next week for our Monday call with Ambassador Chaim Regev, the outgoing Israeli ambassador from Brussels. And also, I would like to once again give the floor to Tom Flesch. I know that he has some closing comments. And Ilan, thank you so much on my behalf.
My pleasure.
Okay, real quickly, I want to thank you. We don't have much time remaining. What you may or may not know, that the overwhelming interest from our viewers keeps increasing every week. And we find ourselves in a situation where we run out of time. And with you, it's the same thing. The audience has questions. There's so much more we can engage in conversation. And I just want to thank you again. And I do want to urge all of our viewers. You heard earlier from Sari about supporting ELNET, supporting our 501c3 deductible status. It is vitally needed. Ilan, you mentioned about getting people, the groups to Israel to see for themselves the conditions. And that's exactly what we do. And the costs to do those have been escalating way beyond. And we're covering it. We're trying to keep up because we know how vitally important it is. So we need all of our viewers, all of our supporters. We need you now. And Israel needs you now. And quite frankly, the way I see it, the free world needs us now. And so I encourage everybody, please donate, help support us, be relevant in what we're doing, because what we're doing is very relevant. So thank you very, very much. And I'm sorry we're going over time, but it's been really, really a great experience. And thank you for helping us.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ilan, and have a great rest of the day. And I'll see all of you soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.